My name is Saskia Sassen. I teach at Columbia University, and my field of research is actually not so easy to identify. I'm interested in complex formations. It could be cities, it could be national states, it could be migration flows that are windows into larger conditions of an epoch. If one really reads my urban work, one realizes I'm not a typical urbanist. I'm using the global city as a window onto a larger global world to avoid becoming very general. So I want to look at specifics, and that's a particularly complex formation that enables that sort of added, if you want, field of knowledge. It's not just the city. When it comes to my role within the IPSP, the first role I have is that of an enthusiastic cheerleader of the project. I really think this is an excellent project. It's going to be not easy to pull it off properly, to evoke interest in larger audiences. You know, this is meant to start a debate in a way. My particular role, my sort of practical role, is to be the co-author of a chapter, the co-organizer of that chapter also, because a chapter actually contains within it up to a dozen authors. So it is sort of a collective project. What I hope the IPSP achieves, and that then encompasses all the different types of participants. So it's not an isolated project, what I do. It truly is a collective project, is to put on the global radar screen some key questions about the urban condition. And it is not simply the phrase that politicians repeat and repeat, which is most people now live in cities. That does not really add to our understanding. So IPSP also intersects, because it is focused on cities, intersects with all the major questions that we confront in today's world, from the environment to migrations to unemployment to inequality to concentration of power. When it comes to the chapter that we're doing, Edgar Peters and me, we are the co-editors, the co-authors. I hope that it actually works as diverse windows, each of the sub-chapters, as diverse windows onto a whole variety of issues that are issues across the world, across different types of spaces, you know, not just a big city like New York or like Mumbai or whatever, so that they can engage an audience that might not be so interested in urban questions per se, but an audience that is interested in certain issues that play out in very interesting ways in cities. That is my hope. I think Edgar probably has a slightly different hope. So we are good co-authors because we are not aiming at the same totally. You know, there's clearly a bit of overlap. Social change is a kind of word that gets used a lot. It's a word that I don't use. It's a term that I don't use. There are certain phrases or categories that are invitations not to think, because we've heard them too many times. So I wouldn't say that social change is the issue. I would say two different types of dynamics. One is making visible what right now is not visible in the urban condition. What is in the shadows, or what is so extreme that our conceptual categories, our statistics, fail to capture that. So that's one set of issues. So in that sense, again, urban space is this extraordinary type of situation where all kinds of urban and non-urban conditions can take on, yes, the typical expected predicted modes or instantiations, but also where something can take a form that we do not expect. So as we cut across diverse types of cities, we will be amazed at some, I hope the reader will be amazed, at some of the ways in which what takes shape in a certain way in New York takes a very different shape in Hong Kong or in Lagos. So, you know, the expected and the unexpected. So that is one whole sort of bundle of questions. The other one is to make visible social injustice, the many different forms that it takes, the many ways in which the charitable attitude towards injustice cannot really address the underlying questions. So on the one hand, the first part is quite analytic, quite experimental, making visible what is not visible, etc., etc. The second one is centered on questions of social justice. And I say social justice rather than equality. Inequality is the buzzword of the moment. I think inequality, the study of inequality, is an extremely important subject. But I think that, number one, we've always lived with inequality. So we need to interpolate inequality. We need to interrogate what kind of inequality is not acceptable. So I'm interested actually in going beyond the issue of inequality, and that is why I mentioned social justice. There are conditions of social justice that can accommodate inequalities. Any complex system, which is differentiated, of course, inevitably, is going to have inequality. So what we need to get at is social justice, a kind of distribution that we can say, this is socially just, even if it is unequal. Otherwise, it becomes fantasy. We're not going to eliminate inequality. It's not possible. It's simply not possible as soon as you have 2 or 3 modes of complex differentiation, and we have far more. So in that sense, social justice rather than the question of inequality. Though I have been doing work on inequality for 30 years, so it's not that I don't like that work. But it seems to me that it is important to, again, to interpolate. What do we mean by inequality? We can't just say inequality is inequality. There is, of course, always the hope when you put in a lot of time into a huge project that involves many people. And I'm a solo author. I really have never co-authored. I've co-authored with a couple of students because they were desperate to get their pieces published. I will not mention their names. But I'm a solo author. I am far too extreme to have a comfortable relationship with any co-author. So what it means for me is a chance, and there is a hope in there, that the other authors are also quite accustomed to develop their view, their perspective, rather than being derivative authors. And that in that multiplication of distinct views of the same X, the X being the urban condition, that I actually will discover something, will see something, that I will see possible ways of repositioning my object of study or repositioning other objects of study, so that we can get sort of an assemblage of elements that repositions the city in a very multifaceted way. There is this point of entry, that point of entry, that the city is not just the city, that you actually have to discover the city. As you enter the space, you need to do the work of discovering, a kind of hermeneutics. Because we think that because it's so material, the city is the city. We see it. No, we don't. So what will we in the end see if we put all these different perspectives together? And in that sense, it will be de facto, not intentionally, but de facto, a kind of hermeneutics of the urban condition today. I think that would be a great outcome. When I started to do this work on the city, because I started out really, my first book, my first big project was on the mobility of labor and capital. Now, in that book, I already began to arrive at the question of the city, but it was arriving from the perspective of global flows. So when I decided to go in depth into the study of the global, this emergent global, one of the first irritants that I encountered was this sort of, this notion that the global world is a seamless world, that that somehow people will communicate, that it will all be flowing and I don't know what. I said, I don't buy this for a minute. So let me formulate a question, a hypothesis that interrogates that notion. The seamless world, the world is flat, the famous book, The World is Flat. And so I decided to focus on the extreme condition, digitized work process like finance, specialized service, everything that could be digitized. In other words, that which could indeed flow globally through digital networks. So I always do that in my research. I raise the ante. I don't want the easy question. I don't want the self-evident. I want to discover the global. So I need to start from a place where, so digital processes, etc., right? And so here was my question, very simple question, very simple interrogation. Do they need these complex, because they were complex digital processes. Finance is one of the most complex economic activities we have. It's algorithmic math. Microeconomics is simply baby food. It couldn't work at all. So we're talking very, very complex forms of knowledge that can be digitized and sold as digitized products. That was the project. And so I asked, the question was, do they ever need a territorial moment, an actual territorial moment? And if so, what is that kind of territorial moment? So I developed a methodology to track, that is why I said I'm not a proper urbanist, to track whether these digital processes, and I really looked at digitized markets, ever somehow hit the ground. And at that point in time, this is the late 1980s, this goes back a very, very long time. At that point, what I saw, according to my methodology, I invented a methodology to do this, that made it difficult in a way, but I hope then, would have substance, would be a robust finding. What I found is that, yes, there is a territorial moment, and yes, it is a rather concentrated one. So it was New York, London, and Tokyo that really accounted for between 60 and 70% of all these digitized markets when they hit the ground. So that then began to lead me to develop an urban conceptual moment in my work. But I started out with global processes. I did not start out as an urbanist. And those people who read the book, most people know about the book, but have never read the book, because it is a very long and boring analysis of a lot of non-urban processes, you see. But anyhow, so, and secondly, what I also saw was they were very different. New York, London, and Tokyo were very different. And today, of course, it's this very easy, not well-informed notion that all global cities are the same and that hence they compete with each other, which is really would be a very negative condition for cities. So one of my critical findings was they do not compete. It is truly a networked system that is multi-sited. So as the world globalizes, as the economy really globalizes in the 1990s, you have more and more global cities. Today we have over 100. And they really are platforms. But each one has specialized differences that make it strong. And those specialized differences arise from the particularities of the economies within which they function. So these are the kinds of things that a lot of the very easy, superficial literature misses because they haven't done their research. They just assume that because the built environment becomes more and more similar in state-of-the-art sort of spaces within these cities, that all these cities are the same. That's incorrect. That built environment functions as infrastructure. It is necessary, but indeterminate. Train tracks can carry wagons that have bombs in them, food in them. These buildings, not these buildings that you're seeing here, but the core, corporate center buildings, they're indeterminate. We need to ask, what kind of finance gets done there? What kinds of specialized lawyering gets done in there? And then we begin to get traction. What leads a lot of observers and writers and researchers to think that with globalization, all these global cities become the same, is that the standards for building the state-of-the-art financial center, the state-of-the-art shopping mall, the state-of-the-art luxury hotel, luxury restaurant, etc., the state-of-the-art luxury apartment, those standards have gone global. The built environment, in other words, is globally standardized in these top places. And as cities were added to the network of global cities, that's what was happening. Right now, that's exactly what is happening in Luanda, one of the poorest cities in the world, but it's the capital of Angola. Angola is full of natural wealth and has a predatory elite. So what is happening? They're transforming Luanda in one of these platforms where everything is up to standard, and then the multinationals will come in and access all that national wealth of Luanda and will make the profits. So the global city really is a platform that enables global actors to enter a country. It has the state-of-the-art built environment they need or they want for their comfort, and they also need to do certain types of transactions. And it is a kind of a frontier space that allows these actors to enter those economies and extract mostly. So there is a very negative side. It's a space of power. The global city is not a pretty, adorable little zone. The global city is a crucial infrastructure for globalizing access to resources, for globalizing the whole notion of financializing economies. This is serious stuff. On the other hand, all these cities, with rare exceptions, are mixed world. They are real cities. And that means that they're also the spaces where those without power get to make a history, get to make a culture, get to make an economy. Think of immigrant communities, in our Western cities, for instance. It takes different forms. So one of the issues for me when I think about cities, and I'm certainly, this is going to be present in the work that I want to do with our chapter, is that up to 100 years ago, from the Western perspective, the frontier was at the edges of empires. Today, there are no more edges of empires. Today, the frontier is in our global cities. That is the space where actors from very different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement. That is what the global city also is. And in that sense, the global city is both a platform that facilitates the financializing of economies, the extraction of natural resources that go to whatever the highest bidder. But on the other side, it is a place, and eventually it becomes one of the few places, any big city, not only global, where those without power have at least the option of putting down their tent, so to say. And politically speaking, to me, critical element, there is this encounter between people from different worlds. And when you throw in that wider world that for me is critical to understand the city, think of land grabs in the global south. That is just, increasing. Millions of people are being displaced from their rural settings. You replace little rural economies with vast plantations, which also means that the earth is going to die much sooner, which also means that they're going to move and grab another piece of land. Where do those people go? A big city is one of the last places where they can go. They can't just plant themselves down in suburbs, in neat suburbs, or in small provincial towns. It's the big anarchic city. So the global city is this extraordinarily complex, multivalent. It's not simply great, nor is it simply very bad. It is a mix. It's a combat zone also. Well, we've always had inequality. There are periods in our Western histories and non-Western histories where inequalities become extreme. And I think that we in the West, but it's also evident in China, etc., we are seeing inequalities that are more extreme than our society can quite handle. And one way in which we see that it cannot handle it is the shrinking of economies, massive unemployment of youth in rich countries, not just in poor countries. And then also, of course, and this is a marker of our contemporary epoch in the West, is the impoverishment of the middle classes. The middle classes really are the key historical actor once our societies become industrialized. They play a strategic role because their consumption matters. Today, we've moved into a different type of economy. Consumption still matters, but the dominant sector is no longer centered on consumption and mass production. It is really centered on the financializing, very, very complex and intermediated economic processes. So this is a different economic dynamic. In that context, a lot of the middle classes, it's sad to say, they are no longer necessary. Their consumption matters, but doesn't matter that much. What we need is armies, like 20% of a city's population, of extremely well-educated, extremely smart, extremely internationalized professional workforces. And they are going to make more money, and they are right now making more money than we ever thought was possible. And we need armies of low-wage workers. Now, when you then begin to look at the story of inequality, what you also begin to see is that at some point, a familiar condition, modest middle classes, poor working classes, etc., can become so extreme that we lose that extreme moment. Our conceptual categories do not capture it. In other words, saying an impoverished middle class doesn't quite capture the absolute extreme where you've lost everything, including your home. And that is happening in all our West, including in Germany. It's an invisible story. And so I argue that there's a kind of systemic edge, a multiplication of systemic edges, where that familiar condition, I repeat, one example is impoverished middle classes, becomes so extreme that we lose sight of it. They become invisible. And I call that systemic edge expulsions. Now, I make the same argument in the book by that name about, for instance, when the devastation, environmental devastations of land and water become so extreme that the land is dead. It's not just environmentally weak or not in good shape. It's dead. Same thing with water. We have a lot, vast stretches of dead land and dead water. Our existing language, environmental degradation is not enough. Climate change is not enough to capture that. So I say we need language to capture that extreme form of the familiar, not the monster, that's a different story, but the familiar, the routinized. It becomes so extreme we don't count it. And so in Expulsions, I try to understand the many, many different ways in which those systemic edges can be constituted. So for instance, I ask myself, the 2.2 million people that are in prison in this country, with some exceptions within that prison population, who are in some sense radically displaced, also in the future when they come out of jail, from a normal life. They're a version of the displaced. The refugee camps, or the camps of the displaced in the global south, which were meant by now to be back home, because supposedly one generation was affected by a war. When the war is over, the displaced were meant to go back home. But home right now is a plantation, it's a private gated city, it's a war zone, 3 generations later, etc., whatever. So I say, at ground level, at the level of facts, are they so different? Are we beginning to see around the world a whole set of conditions that are on the other side of that systemic edge? They are not captured by the particular languages. In other words, what happens in prisons in the United States is pretty extreme. We know that. We have the data now. Extreme. You can barely call that a prison. It's something else that happens there. Not for all, but for most, evidently. So I call for the need to have language that is not stuck on whatever the histories that gave shape to the terms that we use today. And there are moments when you can identify in the West, when prisons begin. There are moments in the international regime when you can identify when the displaced emerges as a category, a formal category, right? And I say, we need another kind of way of understanding what is happening. For instance, I also argue the sort of extreme forms of pollution that come via mining. So I say the gold mines in Montana, which are notorious in terms of the destruction that they have executed, and the biggest nickel-producing complex in the world, that is in Norilsk, in northern Russia, extremely destructive. What matters more? That one comes out of a communist history, Norilsk, and that the other one comes out of a capitalist history, which is how we think about these things today. We think through the existing international system. Or that both have an extraordinary capacity to destroy the environment. So I interpolate existing categories, international system, that is Russia, that is communist, it came out of a gulag, and the Western history. I interpolate that, and I want to bring in a variable that cuts across, that destabilizes both these conditions. I don't negate that those special histories matter, but I say what really matters today. Same thing with the displaced and the prisoners. And that is sort of something that I then develop also in Expulsion. You know, what matters is that both are functioning in a certain way. And I argue in a way we need to de-theorize in order to go back to, in other words, extract it from the specialized fields of knowledge. Within each one of those has been looked at. And we need to de-theorize in order to re-theorize. So I re-theorize the Montana, the gold mines in Montana and Norilsk in northern Russia in terms of saying the fact that one is communist and capitalist, you know what? It doesn't matter as much as something else. And that something else, I repeat, is that extraordinary capacity to destroy the environment. People often ask me, so what's the next killer job I want to do on some concept or category or methodology? And right now, I am writing another little book with the same publisher, Harvard University Press, which is on the territorial. Not territory, but the territorial. And so there, I'm trying to make territory work analytically. Right now, it's a complex concept, but it has taken on one singular meaning, which is national sovereign territory. Complex as that meaning is, if there's only one meaning, it's actually sitting pretty, taking a long analytic siesta, not working analytically. So I want to make it work analytically. So for instance, some of the things that I'm doing are to look to, as the extreme condition, arguing that nomadic peoples make territory. It's a territory that worms itself into existing territories, but they make territory. So that is one extreme. The other extreme is a territorial that is not fully material. So the global city, I argue, is a kind of complex territory that is neither fully global nor fully national. The 10,000 buildings distributed over the territory of the United States that are full-time surveillance and data gathering. If your aunt or your grandmother has been in the United States for 2 hours, she's in that data set, that kind of, ongoing 10,000 buildings. I have a map of those 10,000 buildings. I argue that's a kind of territorial condition that has been constructed with extraordinarily material elements, machines and I don't know what, that is invisible, back to the visibility, invisibility. And that is there, a layer that exists all over the United States, where a lot of stuff with consequences for all of us is being made. So that is how I'm playing. I'm also looking at the Chinese who are constructing on 5 reefs. They're building islands to mark a boundary in a zone that is disputed by South Korea, by Japan. So looking at the territorial through totally different lenses. And my question is, what will I see?